Hello, Fiendlings, how the hell are you? It's been a 20-week-long journey, but we're finally at the end of Oceania. I hope you enjoyed the story, and we'll come back for the next installment. Speaking of, I started podcasting the entire series of The Black in February 2023. Since then, I've had a nearly unbroken stream of weekly episodes from the first book through book 5. That's a fuck ton of content, folks. During that same period, I finished The Black Extinction and wrote The Medusa Zone, Sacculina, and Kill Shelter, as well as podcasted Neptune Scars and re-recorded both Evolution and Oceania. In other words, I've been productive, but not productive enough. The Black Extinction is quote-unquote finished, but it's currently in the hands of my beta readers for the next couple of months. Then it'll come back to my hot little hands, I'll take some of their suggestions to heart, and then I'll do a final edit of the book. After that, it enters production mode with a professional editor. All of this is to say that Extinction won't be starting next week, and I don't have a timeline for when it will begin. My best guess is that sometime in January, you might see the first few episodes. Just don't hold me to that. So what's going to be in the feed next week? Glad you asked. My horror novel, Sacculina, is up next. It'll be a hell of a palate cleanser and will run for about 17 weeks. When it finishes, I'll either begin running Kill Shelter or Extinction. We'll see which gets finished first. Now that I've said all of that, I want to thank you for listening to Oceania and all the other novels in the series. I hope you enjoyed them. If you want to help ensure the podcast remains commercial-free, please consider purchasing any of my ebooks, trade paperbacks, audiobooks, or becoming a Patreon patron or Buy Me a Coffee subscriber. Links are in the show notes. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk next Friday. Here's episode 20, the finale of The Black, Oceania. Chapter 37. Keko didn't exactly make it to New Ireland. A P&G Coast Guard cutter arrived off her port side and guided the damaged ship to the island's southern tip. The journey was longer than it should have been, but the path took them through the shallows and away from the swelling ocean. Storms were on the way, and the ship needed a safe port to avoid sinking. Instead of a 3-hour trip to the New Ireland main harbor, it took more than 5 hours before Keko reached an unmarked marina mainly consisting of pontoons. A few temporary buildings had been erected on the shore waiting for occupants. A medical tent filled with monitoring equipment had already been assembled. Mora had sent a welcoming committee, and the animals would soon meet them. Sarah awoke in her bunk naked and alone, a thin sheet covering her bruised and battered body. A water carafe and a small pill vial sat in the nightstand's cup holder. Sarah was fairly sure she was supposed to take them. She didn't even examine the individual pills before swallowing the entire lot with a long drink of water. At least her throat felt better, and it was easier to breathe. Her heartbeat thumped inside her skull along with a dull ache that seemed as though it was permanent. She'd had concussions in the past, but this was a doozy. The fact that she kept getting blasted probably wasn't helping. At least that seemed over for now, please and thank you. She rose from the bed with a groan and doused herself in the shower, careful to soap herself vigorously in case she managed to get phosphorus on her skin. The one thing she hadn't experienced was any chemical burns, so it was unlikely she'd come across the stuff. She dressed in a baggy sunshirt and her deck pants. When she opened the hatch, she blinked at the man standing at the bottom of the stairs. He wore a uniform she didn't recognize and held an AR in his hands. The PNG native nodded to her. "What's—" Sarah tried to ask, but the word came out as little more than a phlegmy croak. He gestured to the stairs and said in a thick accent, "Go to the cabin." She blinked before shuffling around him and taking the stairs to the main cabin. The area was empty except for Alan and Kojo, who sat at a fold-out table. The pair had their tablets before them, but both looked up at her when she reached the landing. Alan grinned. "Back from the dead," he said. "Our own Lazarus." Sarah smiled. "Just a few bruises." She looked out the cabin window and saw a beach with several Quonset huts. "Where are we?" "New Ireland," Alan said. "Sort of," Kojo corrected him. "Quarantine station." Sarah rolled her eyes. "You're fucking kidding me." Alan shook his head. "I wish. They're checking rags out now. We'll be coming for the rest of us sooner or later." "Lovely." She took a spare seat and joined them at the table. "Any word from Moore or K&B?" "Only to cooperate. About the only orders we've been given." "Great." She suddenly remembered the horizon of fire and the doy burning to cinders. Fuel air bombs? Alan nodded slowly and sadly. And other thermobarics. Annihilated it. I'm betting there's nothing left but ashes and maybe skeletons. She propped her head on an elbow. But we don't know. He shrugged. We don't know. Guess you haven't opened your laptop in a while. Laptop. Shit. She rose from her chair, groaning from a new round of aches and pains and tight muscles, all complaining she needed to stretch. She needed a medieval rack. The soldier, or whatever he was, didn't bat an eye at her as she slipped back into her room. The laptop was where she'd left it. Sighing, she pulled it away from the shelf, sat on the bed, and placed it in her lap. She yawned loudly and brought the computer to life. After logging in, she wasn't surprised to see a cascade of alerts. New messages. 3 from Moore, 2 from K&B. Rather than look at Moore's, she wanted to see what K&B had to say. Truth was, not much. Only that a return flight had been scheduled, to Cairns, Queensland, and from there to Houston, Texas in the good old USA. The itinerary indicated she'd be flying first class all the way home. She couldn't help grinning. The second message was a survey of all fucking things, asking about the ship, Harper and Sinclair, and her experience with the animals. The idea was so ridiculous that she nearly ignored it completely. What kind of lunatics grade their mercenaries based on customer experience questionnaires? Regardless, Sarah dutifully filled out the form, only stumbling on 2 questions about the specialized gear for the mission. In other words, the phosphorus rounds and grenades. While she was polite, she suggested they contact Catfish for a magnesium design. Once she finished filling out the form, she flipped to the first of Moore's messages. Miss Sally-Ann, the mission did not turn out the way I had hoped, but you did an excellent job considering the tools you had to work with, as well as the timeline and personnel. You will be fully debriefed upon your return to Houston. Rest up. You will need it. Dr. Shannon Moore. Sarah read the message twice before shaking her head. Moore, inscrutable as ever, couldn't even send a fucking congratulations message. Instead, the mission hadn't been achieved in a way she had hoped. Sarah reread the message and chuckled darkly. Moore bombed the doy because she wanted confirmation that all of M2 had been destroyed, that there was no doubt it had been made extinct in the archipelago, if not the world. But Moore doubtlessly knew in her heart, as Sarah did, that there would never be a 100% certainty that M2 had been destroyed. Would Moore send an investigative team to the doy to crawl through the rubble and ash and look for signs of life that had survived? Or would Moore park a satellite on top of the area and constantly scan for unexplained changes in the topography? Something like that? If Moore had the resources, Sarah doubted the woman would spare them to ensure the animals had eliminated the immediate threat. Would that require international cooperation? Maybe some kind of deal with the Aussies and PNG? Sarah didn't know, but it seemed likely. Hell, how had Moore set this all up so quickly to begin with? The message contained no text, but satellite photos, each with several circled areas and icons. The images had been taken at an extremely high resolution, enabling her to zoom in and see 5 square meters, without pixelation. She didn't need the icons to tell her what she was looking at. The lush jungle had multiple spots that appeared blighted, its canopies dead, and in some places, large swaths of the flora had simply disappeared, leaving behind barren earth. All the photos were within a square kilometer of the grotto where M2 had been holed up. You knew, Sarah whispered to the room. Moore had known. But when? When had she decided to firebomb the island? After she saw that? Or did something else drive the decision? In the end, it didn't matter. Moore had probably made the only sane choice considering the situation. Sarah just hoped the doy had been vacant of human life. If not, their charred skeletons would be the only remains. Sarah wiped a tear from her eye and moved to the next message from Moore. Ms. Sally-Ann, the project in Houston requires additional resources, preferably 3 to 4. Considering the virtually non-existent talent pool of professionals with experience dealing with M2, I would like your thoughts on recruiting the animals. In short, the Houston project has need of their expertise. If you believe them to be a good fit, please pitch the idea. If you are unable to persuade them, I understand. Dr. Shannon Moore. Sarah sniffed back a laugh. After being so close to sobbing her lungs out, the images of charcoal human briquettes still filling her mind, a recruiting mission was about the most outlandish thing Moore could have requested. She sat staring at the last message, but her eyes no longer saw the words. Everything blurred as she turned over all she'd experienced in the last 96 hours. God, it seemed so much longer than that, like weeks. She finally closed the laptop, returned it to its shelf, and left the cabin. Upon returning to the table, she found Alan with Rags. The large woman wore cargo shorts and a baggy top that billowed in the breeze coming through the open cabin. "Good day, Sarah," she said, her smile wide enough to tease one from Sarah. "Hi, Rags." Alan nodded to Sarah. "Anything important?" She sighed and sat across from him. "Well, I know why they firebombed the Doi." "Fuck," Rags said. "It had started eating the island." It was a statement, not a question. "It did," Sarah said. "The night we destroyed the, She stopped herself before she mentioned hippie. "Shark thing. It started munching through the jungle." "Shit. How much of it?" Sarah frowned. "That's what doesn't make sense. It probably could have taken the entire island if it wanted to. Nothing to stop it, right? No telling how much it could absorb if it wanted to." "Then it would have no place to hide," Rags said softly. Alan and Sarah both stared at her. "What do you mean?" Rags's fingers began to fidget with one another, an embarrassed flush on her cheeks. "Well, we found it in the grotto, right? It could only get so big and still fit in there." "True. So?" "Where else could it hide from the sun?" Sarah thought about that for a moment. The M2 at Urakukur had holed up in the church for shelter. The hippie thing had never had the luxury of finding a hiding spot, although it had tried to become one with the reef, and most certainly had wanted to get on board Keko. Did those count? Of course they did. M2 might be alien or from another dimension or whatever, but it was still an animal, a life form with a pyramid of needs, shelter being the most dire since daylight was its deadly enemy. If Grotto M2 had polished off the island, it couldn't possibly have fit itself inside the cave. It could search for a larger fissure, perhaps even find damage from the earthquakes it could use, but why would it if it didn't have to? It had a lush biome to hunt in, and Sarah was sure it could have maintained its mass relatively easily, without completely ravaging the Doi. "That makes sense," Sarah said finally. "I wonder how long it would have stayed on the island before attempting to escape to the deep." "No telling. I'm just glad the fucking thing is dead." No one spoke for a moment, the sound of the waves and the distant calls of birds filling the dead air between the trio. Sarah finally broke the silence. "I have a question for you, and Kojo when he gets back." Alan raised an eyebrow. "This sounds serious." "It is," she said. She clasped her hands together. "I'm heading back to the U.S. I'd like the three of you to join me." Alan's face remained emotionless, and he merely blinked. Rags chuckled, but the sound had no humor. "Shit," Sarah thought. "Well, that's a no-sale if I ever saw one." "For what?" Alan finally asked. Sarah sighed. "Remember Miskatonic? It's possible an M2 entity survived. If so, I need a team. Seeing as my old one's been disbanded, its members either dead or unavailable, I thought I'd ask you." Sarah said the word unavailable as flippantly as she could, but there was no way to hide her distaste for it. "A team?" he asked. "To do what?" Sarah's face turned to stone, Givens's face popping into her mind for the briefest moment. "Hunt, kill." The words fell to the table without drama or enmity. Just the facts. Alan glanced at Rags. "What do you think?" "This shit's fucking balmy," Rags said. "What idiot cunt signs on to fight these things?" Alan laughed. "Same idiot cunts that blasted the things to hell and back." Rags's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. Finally, her open lips turned into a smile. "Fine. 2 idiot cunts will join you." Sarah grinned. "I'll ask Kojo when he gets back." No you won't," Alan said, one finger raised. "Let me handle that, okay?" Confused, Sarah said, "Okay." She took a sip of water and leaned back in the seat. "What happened to the survivors?" Alan said, "They're being tended to. Guess P&G will resettle them after they've been debriefed." "Debriefed? By whom?" Alan shrugged. "Not my bailiwick, but I was assured they'd leave this place alive and with more than enough money to start over again, someplace else." Someplace else. According to Kojo, the natives that had lived here for centuries were slowly being evacuated, forced to flee the continuing rise of the ocean and facing the end to their way of life, if not their culture. What the sea hadn't taken, the volcanoes and earthquakes had. In a few years, maybe New Ireland and New Britain would be as abandoned as the Doi had been. She heard steps outside the cabin, and Kojo appeared. If not for the micro-craters in his face from flying debris and the stitches in his skull, he didn't appear to be in bad shape.
"Hi, Sarah," Kojo said. "Good to see you."
"You too." Alan looked knowingly at the man. "They ready for her?" Kojo nodded and jerked a thumb behind him.
"You're up, Sarah. Time to get poked and prodded."
"Lovely," she said, and rose from the chair. "See you soon, I hope." Chapter 38. The quarantine procedures were more or less a joke. The medical technicians, or scientists, or whatever the hell they were, had examined her naked body with magnifying glasses, bathed her in UV light, and followed it all up with a chemical shower of some kind. Just a precaution against phosphorus poisoning, or so they acclaimed through their thickly accented English. With all of that done, including disinfecting her already disinfected wounds, they pronounced her clean of any hazardous substances and kicked her back to Keko. Evening was coming on now, the sun a little more than a finger's width away from the horizon. The spectrum of colors hung there like a technicolor dream, the light feeling warm and comfortable on her face. After milling through a few soldiers crowding the gangway, she made her way up the ramp into the aft deck. Alan stood at the gunwale looking west, a ball cap covering his bald pate. Rags and Kojo weren't on deck, but she heard their voices from the cabin. Someone was cooking, and Sarah's stomach growled with raw hunger. When was the last time she'd eaten? She couldn't even remember. As she approached Alan, he turned slightly and tipped the bill of his cap. "Oh, 5x5? "Clean bill of health. Well, not clean exactly." "Let me guess," he said. "Rest, relaxation, and no more fucking hits to the head." She grinned. "Not in so many words, but yeah." He nodded. "Expected. I've got 2 hairline fractures in my ribs, a bruised collarbone, and more than a few busted capillaries." "In other words, you'll be fine." "Exactly," he said, his smile widening. "Just no boxing roos for a few days." "No problem in Houston, Alan. The roos are only at the zoo." "They have gators, though, don't they?" Sarah cocked her head slightly. The boyish grin on his face held something more than simple relief. He looked as though he were happy to see her. "Think we do. Bayou City and all of that." "Well then," he said, taking off his cap and wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow. "My only demand for this trip is that I see a gator in the bayou." She chuckled. "You wrestle crocs?" "Fuck no," Alan said, the swagger disappearing from his voice, his eyes comically widening. "That's dangerous. I'd rather be shot at. But I do like them." "Figures." Alan nodded toward the cabin. "Should have dinner soon. Chance to talk to Kojo." She raised a brow. "I need to persuade him?" The Aussie shook his head and pulled his cap low over his eyes. "Not persuade, but he has a story to tell you." Harper didn't join them for dinner, and neither did Sinclair. Sarah still hadn't seen the man and thought she never would. When Rags appeared at the cabin hatch to call them for chow, Sarah found the cabin empty except for her and Kojo. Sarah didn't ask why Harper hadn't joined them, figuring she'd be told if it was important. If not, she'd just put it down to yet another of their host's eccentricities. As hungry as she'd been, Sarah couldn't eat more than one of the tasty fillets and 2 prawns. The animals hardly spoke, and an air of disquiet seemed to have settled over the table. Sarah was beginning to wonder if Rags and Alan had changed their minds, or if that depended on what Kojo had to say. After finishing dinner, putting away leftovers and grabbing beers from a cooler, the 4 returned to the table. Sarah didn't know how to start, or even if she should. Luckily, Alan saved her. "Sarah's asked if we want to go to Houston. Rags and I have already agreed. It's Kojo who's on the fence." Sarah met Kojo's eyes. "You have concerns?" The PNG native slowly nodded, his hands passing the beer can to one another. "The doi is gone," he said softly. "Can't do anything about that. It's done, and not your fault." He added that last when he noticed her expression shift, the guilt plain on her face. "But there is something else. Something worse." Sarah shivered. What could be worse? In truth, she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Kojo looked haunted. "The woman you rescued. Her name is Rika, and her son is Swando. She told me what happened. Her friend Wei found the lifeboat. She, her son, and her husband went to Uruakukra to meet him and help secure it." He stared down at the table for a moment. "Swando had to crawl through the lifeboat collar to release the hatch. After he did and climbed back out, Wei went into the lifeboat. The sun had set, and with no light inside the lifeboat, whatever M2 had been inside managed to infect him.
At least, I think that's what happened. Rika wasn't exactly sure. Shortly after Wei complained of burning in his leg, the pirates showed up. They must have heard Wei calling for Rika over the radio. Regardless, they killed Wei and dumped him overboard when he tried to stab one of them. Ah, Alan said. Wondered how our church M2 got to be where it was. Kojo nodded. My thoughts too. Alan gestured for him to continue. Kojo took a sip of beer. The pirates killed Rika's husband and dumped him alongside Wei. They only wanted Rika, the boy, and the lifeboat. He cleared his throat. The pirates locked them up in the hold and kept them there for 2 days while they secured the lifeboat and holed up. Then, one night, she heard gunfire and screams. The pirates, however, never came back. They were down there, starving and dying of dehydration. If you and Rags hadn't rescued them, they would have died long before M2 found them. Silence fell over the cabin, and Kojo took another sip of beer. He looked as though he had something more he wanted to say, but Sarah wasn't quite sure what it was. Finally, he looked up from the table and met her eyes. Liger set the beast free. It destroyed a rig. It destroyed the entire doy. Killed how many in Houston? She didn't answer him. Wherever it goes, it brings death. Whoever hunts it brings the same, suffers the same. He gestured to Sarah. You think you can destroy it? She didn't answer because, in truth, she didn't know the answer. We kill humans, the kind that need to be gone, the kind that rapes a woman in front of her son right after murdering a husband and father. That is evil I can punish. That is an evil I can name, an evil I can understand. But, he said with sadness in his eyes, M2 isn't human. M2 isn't of this earth. Alan fought a smirk and barely won. Kojo didn't seem to notice. M2 isn't evil. I don't think it knows the concept of good and bad, so how could it be? She wasn't sure, but Kojo might have been asking himself that question. How do you fight something you don't understand? Kojo asked her. Sarah was quiet for a moment, giving the question time to sink in. We fight with fire. We fight with light. We fight it any way we can until it's extinct. We do not let it survive. The quartet sipped at their beers in the awkward silence that followed. Sarah wasn't sure what Kojo wanted from her or expected her to say. When he finally finished his beer, he crumpled the can in his meaty fist and rose from his chair. I'm coming to Houston, he said to Sarah. Good night. Kojo turned and walked down the stairs to the cabins. Sarah watched him go, feeling more than a little confused. Rags downed her beer and pulled a fresh one from the cooler. Dramatic, isn't he? Sarah shrugged. Guess I said the right thing? Alan nodded. You did. What he wanted to hear, anyway. And what was that? Dunno. You'd have to ask him. Not tonight, Sarah said with a yawn. The beer was catching up with her. Considering the beating she'd taken over the past several days, she could sleep for a week and still not feel rested. She could only hope that once she landed in Houston, she'd have a few days of light duty before whatever happened. Alan cast his eyes out the cabin window, taking in the purpling sky. In a moment or two, night would fully descend over New Ireland. Time for a stroll, I think. Rags tapped her fingers against her fresh beer. I'm going to catch up on the news while I finish this beer and sleep. Jet lag is going to suck. Can say that again, Sarah said. She glanced at Alan. Want some company? Can't promise a mojito, he said, but grab 2 more beers and we can at least make a wish when the Southern Cross shows up. She nodded with a grin, downed the last of the dregs in her can, and grabbed 2 more from the cooler. Rags smiled at her and said good night. Sarah wished her the same and followed Alan out onto the deck. They sat in comfortable silence at the stern, their eyes gazing out over the dark horizon and the stars that continued to pop into existence. When the Southern Cross appeared, Sarah stared at it for several moments, with only the ocean's constant whisper for company. When she finally noticed Alan looking at her, she broke her stare with the sky and met his eyes. What? She asked, a blush on her cheeks. Just enjoying the sight of a lady, enjoying her evening, Alan said. He drained the last of his can and stashed it in one of the cup holders. Easy to forget we can still have those moments. She knew what he meant. It had taken her months after coming back from the sandbox to allow herself to smile, let alone enjoy the company of a human being who wasn't Givens or Perkins. Blood, smoke, explosions, and death. That combination could wear you down, drain your humanity, and leave you a lifeless husk or a dangerous psychopath, if you let it. One look at these stars, though, so alien from the northern hemispheres,
was enough to prove there was more than all of that, more than M2. The world was still here. The reality she'd known before her visit to Ben Top still ruled existence. M2 was the aberration, not the norm. "Still owe me a mojito," Sarah said, brushing her free hand against his. His fingers gently probed hers, and she clasped his hand. "I'll do with that. Maybe we can have one on our way to Houston." "I think K&B owes us that much," she said, moving closer. Alan snaked a hand around her waist and leaned in. She responded by putting hers around his. "How about a kiss for now? Down payment?" She met his lips, and for a while there was nothing but comfort and the stars.